A black woman was working quietly in her garage, minding her own business when the sirens suddenly wailed outside. Police cars skidded to a halt in front of her home, lights flashing. Without warning, officers jumped out of their vehicles and rushed toward her garage. Confused and startled, she stepped outside to ask what was happening, but the officers ignored her. They weren't there to ask questions. They were there to investigate. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to make sense of the situation. "You're under investigation," one officer snapped, not offering any further explanation. The tension in the air was palpable as they approached the garage, ready to break down the door. The woman, calm but determined, didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall and said something that completely stunned the officers. "Before you do anything, you should know who I am." The officers froze, puzzled, unsure of what to make of her calm demeanor in the face of their aggressive approach. What happens next? How will they react when they discover who she really is? The raid on the woman's garage began with tension in the air. Officers moved quickly but cautiously, their eyes darting from the woman to the garage. They were looking for anything suspicious, anything that could justify the raid. The woman, though, remained calm. Her expression was one of quiet defiance, but there was no sign of panic or fear in her eyes. One officer, a younger man with a stern look, was the first to speak. "What is all this? We're here for a reason, and you can't just stop us." He looked at her with suspicion, clearly not impressed by her calm demeanor. The woman simply crossed her arms. "Oh, you're wasting your time," she said flatly. "What are you really looking for?" The officer didn't answer her immediately. He gestured to his colleagues to continue searching, as if trying to ignore her question. But he could sense that there was something off about this situation. Why would a woman like her be so composed during a raid? Another officer, one who had been quietly observing from the back, stepped forward. "What's your name?" he asked sharply. The woman looked him in the eye and replied, "I don't think that's important right now. What is important is that you're making a mistake." The officers paused, exchanging looks. This wasn't the reaction they had expected from someone under investigation. They thought she'd be scared or defensive, but instead, she was calm, almost too calm. The younger officer was still skeptical. "What do you mean a mistake? What exactly is going on here? We've been tipped off and you're not going to talk your way out of this." The woman sighed. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" she asked, her voice steady. "You're wasting your time. I'm connected to someone who can stop this right now." The officers looked at each other, trying to process what she had just said. They had heard rumors of her connections, but they weren't sure if they should believe them. "I work with the mayor," the woman said flatly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "This is a misunderstanding. If you really want to clear things up, call him. You'll get the truth." At the mention of the mayor, the officers hesitated. The tension in the air grew thicker, and the younger officer took a step back. He didn't want to get involved in anything political, especially not if it could cost him his career. He glanced over at the senior officer, who was still trying to process what was happening. "You work with the mayor?" the senior officer asked, his voice full of disbelief. "Yes," the woman answered, "and if you continue this rate, I'm sure he'll be happy to get involved. You're making a mistake." The officers exchanged another look, but the senior officer seemed to be considering her words. He took a step toward her, his face growing more serious. "If you're lying to us—" "I'm not lying," she interrupted him, her voice firm but calm. "I'm telling you the truth." The senior officer didn't look convinced. He raised his hand, signaling to his team to continue searching. But there was a hint of hesitation in his movements. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he wasn't about to back down. "Let's get this over with," the officer muttered under his breath. He turned back to the woman, still skeptical but starting to wonder if she was telling the truth. As the officers continued searching the garage, the woman stood there, quiet and unmoving. She wasn't going to panic, wasn't going to get flustered. She'd been in tough situations before, and this was no different. If the officers wanted to play this game, she was ready to finish it. A few minutes passed in tense silence. The officers rummaged through the garage, inspecting every corner, checking for anything that could justify their presence. But nothing significant had been found. The woman's garage was spotless, organized, and contained only ordinary belongings. There was no sign of anything illegal. The younger officer, still skeptical, approached her once again. "I don't understand. If you really do work with the mayor, why are you even in a situation like this? What are you hiding?" She smiled slightly, but there was no humor in her expression. "I'm not hiding anything," she said. "I'm just a person trying to get by. But you, on the other hand, are the ones who've been deceived." The senior officer overheard her and approached. "What do you mean?" he asked, the anger creeping back into his voice. "What's your point?" "My point," she began, her voice firm and controlled, "is that this situation isn't what you think it is. You've been given false information, and now you're wasting your time. Call the mayor, and I promise you, this will all be cleared up." There was an uneasy silence for a moment. The officers exchanged glances, and the tension in the air reached its peak. The senior officer, unsure of what to do next, finally relented. He pulled out his phone, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He dialed the number of the mayor's office, hoping that the call would clarify everything. As the phone rang, the woman stood there, calm and collected, her arms still crossed over her chest. She wasn't worried. She knew that the truth would come out soon enough. The phone rang several times before someone finally picked up. "Mayor's office," a voice said. "This is Officer Harris," the officer began. "I'm calling regarding a woman here. She claims to be working with you, and we've been conducting a raid at her garage. I need confirmation on this." The silence on the other end of the phone was palpable. Then a voice, calm but firm, responded. "Yes, Officer Harris, you are speaking to the right person. I've been in touch with this woman. She's not to be disturbed." The officer's face was drained of color. "I see. Thank you." The tension in the room broke. The officer hung up the phone slowly, still processing what had just happened. He turned to the woman who was standing calmly before him. The moment of truth had arrived, and it was clear that the situation was about to change drastically. "Call off the raid," he muttered to his team, who were already starting to pack up their equipment. "We've made a mistake." The woman nodded slightly, but said nothing. She had already won. The officers left, leaving the woman standing in her garage, calm and victorious. The garage was quiet after the officers had left, but the tension in the air lingered. The woman stood there, her arms still crossed, looking at the spot where the officers had been only moments ago. It was hard to believe what had just happened, but there was no time for celebrating yet. The battle wasn't over. She knew that calling the mayor had shifted the tide in her favor, but the question now was, what would the officers do next? Would they learn from their mistake, or would they continue with their preconceived notions? The woman wasn't sure, but she wasn't going to back down now. The phone call to the mayor had done its job. It had revealed the truth. Yet she still felt the weight of the situation. The way she had been treated, the assumptions made about her based on nothing but her appearance, were all too familiar. She wasn't the first person to face this kind of injustice, and she wouldn't be the last. As she thought about it, she could hear the officers leaving her property, their footsteps fading into the distance. They were embarrassed, but she wasn't sure if they truly understood what had just happened. They had judged her without knowing her story, without giving her the chance to explain herself. It was a mistake, yes, but how many others had been in her shoes? How many others had been treated unfairly simply because of assumptions? Her mind raced, and as she took a deep breath, she knew she needed to make this moment count. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped her back to reality. She straightened up and glanced toward the street. It was one of the officers, a different one from before, coming back. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it. She wasn't going to let anything rattle her. The officer stepped out of the car, his face more serious than before. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't make any sudden moves, and he didn't approach the garage right away. He stood at a distance for a moment, just watching her. The woman didn't flinch. She met his gaze calmly, her posture unwavering. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else make her feel inferior anymore. "I'm sorry," the officer said, his voice low but sincere. He didn't expect her to respond right away, and she didn't. She simply waited. He paused, unsure how to proceed, and then spoke again. "I made a mistake earlier. I should have listened to you. I shouldn't have assumed the worst." For a moment, the woman said nothing. She wasn't sure if this apology was genuine or if he was just trying to get out of a difficult situation. But as she looked at him, she saw a flicker of something. Perhaps it was regret, or maybe it was the realization that his assumptions had cost him. "I appreciate you saying that," she replied calmly, though her words were careful. She wasn't going to let him off the hook too easily. But it's not enough to just say sorry. You have to change the way you see people. The officer's eyes lowered to the ground. He clearly wasn't expecting her to speak like that. He had been prepared for anger, for a confrontation, but what he got was the truth. "I know," he said quietly, "and I will. I've learned something today, and it's not just about you. It's about how I've treated others in the past." She nodded, not because she was ready to forgive, but because she was seeing a glimpse of change. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "I know what it feels like to be judged without reason," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I've been on the receiving end of that more times than I can count. But we all deserve respect. We all deserve to be treated with dignity. It doesn't matter who we are or where we come from." The officer looked at her, a mix of guilt and understanding in his eyes. He knew she was right. He had been quick to judge, quick to act, without even considering the person standing in front of him. The black woman who had been treated like a criminal was, in fact, someone far more important than he had realized. And now, he was beginning to understand the true meaning of respect. "Do you think I can change?" he asked, his voice vulnerable. The woman's expression softened slightly. She wasn't going to hold on to anger, but she was also not going to let him think that a simple apology would make everything go away. It wasn't just about him. It was about everyone. About creating a world where respect was the standard, not the exception. "You have to change," she said simply, "but it's not going to be easy. You'll have to think differently, act differently, and you'll need to unlearn the biases you've had." The officer stood still for a moment, clearly reflecting on her words. He wanted to change, but he knew that doing so would require more than just acknowledging his mistakes. It would require real effort, real work. "I'll do better," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'll work on myself. I won't let this happen again." The woman didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him for a moment. studying his face. She could see that something had shifted in him. He wasn't perfect, but maybe he was on the path toward understanding. The officer's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though a weight had been lifted off them. He didn't expect this conversation to end like this. He had expected her to be angry, to lash out, to demand more. But instead, she had given him something even more valuable, a lesson in humanity. "I hope this is the beginning of something better," the officer said softly. The woman didn't say anything. She simply nodded, turned, and walked back toward the entrance of her garage, her head held high. She wasn't going to linger on this moment too long. The encounter had happened, and now it was time to move forward. The officer watched her walk away, the weight of the conversation settling in his chest. He had learned something today, and though it wasn't an easy lesson, it was one he wouldn't forget. The officer stood motionless for a moment, watching the woman walk away. The sound of her footsteps faded into the distance, but his mind was still buzzing with everything that had just happened. He couldn't stop thinking about the words she had said. "You have to treat people with respect, no matter what they look like." For a moment, he had felt like he was on top of the world, with his badge and his power. But now, standing alone on the sidewalk, he felt small. He had been wrong. So wrong. It wasn't just the woman he had judged based on her appearance. It was a pattern that had played out time and time again in his life. He had acted out of assumption, not understanding that everyone, regardless of their background, deserved respect. The weight of his actions weighed on him as he stared down at the ground. He had never thought about it like this before. His whole life, he had followed rules, made decisions based on what he thought he knew, but now it felt like he had been living in a bubble. He had ignored the humanity of others, dismissing it because of his own assumptions. "I've made a mistake," he muttered to himself, the guilt starting to rise. His chest felt tight, and he couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head when he first stopped her. He had raised his voice without reason. He had assumed she was guilty simply because she looked different. His authority, something he'd always relied on, had clouded his judgment, and in the process, he had disrespected someone who had done nothing wrong. The officer's mind flashed back to his interactions with other people, the little moments, the microaggressions, the assumptions he had made over the years. How many times had he acted out of fear or discomfort? How many times had he judged someone because of their race, their clothes, or the way they spoke? It wasn't just the woman he had treated unfairly. It was a pattern. He remembered the look on her face when she calmly told him, "You don't have to apologize. What's important is that you treated me like a criminal based on assumptions." Those words echoed in his mind. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting or demanding revenge. She had simply pointed out the truth that he had been blind to for so long. The officer sat in his car, trying to clear his thoughts. But the more he thought, the more he realized that this wasn't just about one mistake. This was about changing his entire approach to life, to how he viewed others. He had a responsibility, not just as an officer but as a human being, to treat people with dignity. It wasn't enough to just do his job. He needed to be better. He needed to change. "I've been doing this for so long," he thought, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. "How many other times have I made mistakes like this? How many people have I judged based on what they looked like?" He had never really thought about it before, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. The officer had thought he was doing his job, keeping things in order, but now he saw how he had contributed to the problem. "I can't go on like this," he said aloud, shaking his head. His voice was filled with frustration. He couldn't ignore the way things had always been. He had to do something about it. His mind flashed back to the woman standing tall as she walked away. She had shown him something important, something that he couldn't forget. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about the badge. It was about respect. The officer let out a deep breath. He wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to change. The first step was acknowledging that he had been wrong. The next step was doing something about it. He thought about how he had reacted. He had let his authority get in the way of understanding the situation. He had let fear and assumptions dictate his actions, rather than facts and fairness. But the woman had shown him that change was possible. She hadn't reacted with anger. She had just spoken the truth, and that truth had made him stop and think. The officer knew it wasn't going to be easy. He had built his life on certain beliefs and assumptions, but those beliefs were flawed. It wasn't going to be simple to unlearn years of ingrained behavior, but he was willing to try. He had to. "I can be better," he thought. "I will be better." As he sat in his car, he realized that the moment wasn't about redemption for him. It was about taking responsibility for his actions and understanding how much his behavior impacted others. It wasn't enough to just apologize and move on. He needed to make a lasting change, not just in his professional life, but in how he interacted with people outside of his job. He knew this was a turning point. He started the car, his mind clearer than it had been before. He wasn't just thinking about the woman anymore. He was thinking about his future, how he would change and how he could help others understand what he had just learned. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he thought about the people he had judged in the past. What would they think if he approached them differently? What if he could be the one to help them see the importance of respect, the way the woman had helped him see it? He had made a mistake, but he wouldn't let that mistake define him. It was time to change, and it was time to start making things right. The officer sat alone in his car, parked by the side of the road. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he stared out the window, his thoughts consumed by the events of the past hour. His mind kept replaying the interaction he had just had with the woman, how he had stopped her for a simple traffic violation, how he had treated her harshly, and how she had responded with calm and dignity. Everything he thought he knew about his job, everything he thought he understood about his interactions with the public, was now in question. He was a police officer, a man sworn to protect and serve, but in that moment, he had failed. He had failed the very person he was meant to protect. His heart sank as he thought about how quickly he had judged her, how he had let his assumptions take control of the situation without stopping to ask questions, without giving her the benefit of the doubt. The officer replayed the words she had said to him, her voice steady despite the tension. "You have to treat people with respect, no matter what they look like." Those words kept echoing in his mind, over and over again. He had heard them, but he hadn't really listened to them until now. In that moment, he had thought he was in control, but the reality was, she had been the one teaching him a lesson. And it wasn't just about him and her. It was about the way he had treated so many people before her. He thought back to his career, to all the times he had pulled someone over, stopped someone on the street, or made assumptions based on the way they looked. It was easy, too easy, to assume that someone was guilty because of their appearance. It was something he had been doing for years, and he hadn't even realized the harm it caused. He had always prided himself on following the rules, on doing things by the book. But now, he saw that the book wasn't enough. It was about understanding people, about seeing them for who they truly were, not just what they appeared to be on the surface. The officer closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, trying to clear his head. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could change his future. He had to. He thought about the many interactions he'd had with people over the years. How many of those interactions had been tainted by his biases? How many people had he treated unfairly, just like the woman he had just encountered? How many times had he dismissed someone, assumed they were guilty, or treated them with less respect than they deserved simply because of their race, their clothing, or their appearance? He felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He was supposed to be a protector, not someone who added to the problem. But the realization hit him hard. He had been part of the problem. For years, he had perpetuated the very biases he now realized he needed to overcome. He wasn't just some lone officer making a mistake. He was part of a system that had been built on these very biases, a system that often treated people based on assumptions rather than fairness. The officer's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on his window. He startled and looked up, his heart racing, but then he saw who it was. It was his partner, Officer Davis, who had been with him during the shift. The officer rolled down his window, trying to mask the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. "You good?" Officer Davis asked, his voice filled with concern. The officer wasn't sure how to answer. He didn't know if he was good. He didn't feel good. He felt guilty, confused, and disillusioned by his own actions. "I messed up," the officer finally admitted, his voice quiet but filled with regret. "I really messed up." Officer Davis raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I just treated someone like they were less than me, and I didn't even think twice about it," the officer explained, his voice trembling slightly. "I stopped this woman for jaywalking, and I didn't give her the respect she deserved. I assumed she was just another person breaking the rules, but she's so much more than that. She's human, and I treated her like she wasn't." The words hung in the air for a moment. Officer Davis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to be processing what his partner had just said. The officer could tell that Davis wasn't judging him, but there was a sense of discomfort. It wasn't every day that a fellow officer admitted to making such a mistake. "You've been doing this job for years," Officer Davis finally said. "We all make mistakes, man. But what matters is that you realize it, and you're owning up to it." The officer nodded slowly. He appreciated his partner's words, but they didn't make the guilt go away. "I know," he said softly, "but this isn't just about one mistake. It's about all the people I've treated like that. It's about how many times I've let my biases shape my actions. How many times I've made assumptions because of the way people look." Officer Davis didn't have an immediate answer, but he put a hand on his partner's shoulder. "You're right. It's about changing the way we think, changing the way we act. But you can't change it all overnight. You start by doing better, one step at a time." The officer sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation settle into his bones. "I don't know if I can change all at once, but I'm going to try. I have to try." Officer Davis nodded again, his eyes softening. "That's all anyone can ask for. Just keep trying." As his partner walked away, the officer sat in his car, reflecting on what he had just said. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was beginning to understand what it truly meant to serve and protect. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about seeing the humanity in every person, regardless of their race, their appearance, or their background. It was about acknowledging the biases within himself and doing the work to change them. The officer looked up and watched the woman as she disappeared down the street. He couldn't help but feel grateful for her. She had shown him a side of himself he hadn't been ready to face. And though he hadn't said it before, he owed her an apology, a real one. He didn't know if he would ever see her again, but he knew he had learned something important from their encounter. And that, he realized, was more valuable than any ticket, any rule, or any badge. Meanwhile, the woman continued on her way, feeling a sense of calm. She hadn't expected the officer to apologize or for him to change in the moment, but she knew that their encounter would have an impact. She had spoken up, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been treated unfairly by authority figures just because of their appearance. She was proud of herself, not because she had been right or had won the argument, but because she had stood up for fairness. She had stayed calm, collected, and had shown the officer a better way, the way people should treat each other. And though she knew that this one moment couldn't change everything, she had planted a seed. It was now up to the officer and everyone else who had witnessed it to decide whether or not they would let that seed grow. As the officer watched the woman walk away, he realized that the world needed more people like her, people who stood up for what was right, who showed patience in the face of injustice, and who were willing to teach others through their actions. The officer knew his journey wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. He wasn't going to pretend that he could fix everything overnight, but he had learned something important. He was going to try every day to be better, to treat people better, to let go of the biases that had been built up over years, and to see the humanity in every person he encountered. "Change starts with me," he said quietly to himself, a new sense of resolve settling in his chest. And with that, he drove off, his heart lighter than it had been before. As the officer sat in his car, his mind continued to race. He thought about the encounter with the woman, how it had opened his eyes to something much deeper than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about the woman. It was about everyone he had encountered before her, everyone he had judged too quickly. He knew now that things had to change. This story isn't just about one encounter. It's about how we all need to treat people with respect, regardless of their appearance, their race, or where they come from. No one should be judged based on assumptions. The officer learned this lesson, but the question is, have we all learned it? What would you have done in this situation? How would you have responded if you were in the officer's shoes, or if you were the woman being unfairly judged? Have you ever experienced unfair treatment? Share your story in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going. It's time to raise awareness and make a difference. It starts with us, one person at a time. If you believe in respect, equality, and fairness for all, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe. We need more people to join this conversation and help spread this important message. Let's stand together and make the world a better place. Your voice matters.